The morning sun cast long shadows through the windows of the Cedar Ridge schoolhouse, illuminating dust motes that danced above 23 small desks arranged in neat rows. Ezra Whitman stood before the chalkboard, his weathered hands moving with surprising steadiness as he wrote arithmetic problems in careful script. At 68, his silver hair caught the light like spun metal, and wire-rimmed spectacles perched on a nose that had been broken more than once, though the children never asked about such things. 12 students sat before him, ranging from little Abigail Morrison, barely 6, and still learning her letters, to strapping young Marcus Henley, 14, and already showing the makings of a man. Between them sat Sarah Beth Caldwell, 8 years old with cornflower blue eyes and braids that bounced when she raised her hand to answer questions. She had been coming to school for only 3 months now, ever since the tragedy that took her parents. The town folk had taken her in, but it was here in the schoolhouse that she seemed to find peace. Ezra's voice carried the gentle authority of a man accustomed to teaching, though something in its timbre suggested depths the children could not fathom. "This morning finds us working with multiplication tables," he said, tapping the board with a wooden pointer. "Sarah Beth, would you show us 4 times 7 on your slate?" The little girl bent over her work with fierce concentration, her tongue poking from the corner of her mouth as she calculated. 28, Mr. Whitman, she announced proudly, holding up her slate. "Very good, child." Ezra's approval brought a smile that lit up her entire face. Mathematics builds the mind like exercise builds the body. Both require discipline and practice. As he spoke, his eyes drifted momentarily to the window that faced west toward the horizon. It was a habit the children had grown accustomed to, this periodic scanning of the landscape beyond their small town. What they could not know was that those pale gray eyes, kind as they seemed when focused on lessons, had once been capable of reading sign and movement across vast distances. The way he stood, too, spoke of something other than a simple schoolmaster. His shoulders remained square despite his age, and when he walked between the desks to check their work, his steps fell silent on the wooden floor. Above the chalkboard, mounted on simple wooden brackets, hung an old Winchester rifle. Ezra had explained to curious students that it was merely decoration, a reminder of the frontier days when every building needed protection. The weapon appeared well-maintained despite its apparent retirement, its brass receiver polished to a warm glow. If any of the children had possessed the knowledge to examine it closely, they might have noticed the series of small notches carved into the stock, but such details escaped young eyes focused on lessons and play. The schoolhouse itself reflected the care of its master. Every book stood precisely aligned on the shelves that lined the eastern wall. Maps of Texas and the broader United States hung straight and clean, showing territories and states with mathematical precision. Even the firewood stacked beside the potbelly stove displayed an orderliness that spoke of military habit, though the children simply appreciated that their classroom stayed warm through the winter months. During the mid-morning recess, Ezra stepped onto the schoolhouse porch while his students played in the yard behind the building. From this vantage point, he could observe both the children and the approaching roads that led into Cedar Ridge. His gaze lingered on the western trail, the one that wound through the Badlands where decent folks rarely traveled. Something in the quality of the light, perhaps, or the way the wind carried scents from distant places, set his nerves on edge this particular morning. Marcus Henley approached the porch, his voice breaking slightly as adolescent voices do. "Mr. Whitman, sir, would you tell us again about the Indian Wars? The older boys find your stories mighty interesting." Ezra's expression grew thoughtful, and for a moment something flickered behind those pale eyes, like winter lightning seen from far away. "Some stories are better left in the past, son. History has a way of repeating itself when we least expect it. Better to focus on your studies and building something good in this world." The boy nodded respectfully and returned to his friends, though Ezra could see the disappointment in his young face. The children often pressed him for tales of excitement and adventure, never understanding that some memories carried weights too heavy for young shoulders. His own past remained locked away like a book written in a language they could not read. As the students settled back into their afternoon lessons, Ezra noticed Sarah Beth glancing repeatedly toward the western window. The child possessed an intuition beyond her years, perhaps sharpened by the loss that had shaped her young life. When she caught him watching, she offered a small smile, but her eyes held questions she lacked words to ask. The afternoon progressed with geography lessons and reading practice, but Ezra found his attention divided. Years of training and experience had taught him to trust the subtle warnings that most men ignored. The very quality of the silence from the western road bothered him, as did the absence of the usual supply wagon that should have passed through by now. Small things, perhaps, but small things had kept him alive through decades when death rode close at hand. As the final lesson of the day concluded, Ezra dismissed his students with unusual efficiency. Sarah Beth lingered as the others gathered their slates and primers, her small face creased with concern. "Is something wrong, Mr. Whitman?" she asked in a voice barely above a whisper. Ezra knelt to her level, his weathered hands gentle as he adjusted one of her braids. "Nothing you need worry about, little one. But perhaps it would be wise to head straight home today. No dawdling by the creek or picking wildflowers." The child nodded solemnly, recognizing something in his tone that demanded obedience. As she joined the last of the departing students, Ezra stood in the doorway and watched them scatter toward their homes throughout the town. Only when the last child disappeared from view did he turn back into the empty schoolhouse, his movements taking on a different quality entirely. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. The gentle stoop of the elderly teacher straightened into the alert posture of a man accustomed to danger. His steps, which had been measured and careful, became silent and purposeful. Moving to his desk, he opened the bottom drawer and withdrew a box of cartridges, checking each one with practiced efficiency. The Winchester above the chalkboard seemed to draw his gaze like a lodestone draws iron. Outside, the western horizon showed a dust cloud that spoke of multiple riders moving at deliberate speed. Ezra's pale eyes narrowed as he calculated distance and time, his mind automatically falling into patterns of thought that had nothing to do with teaching arithmetic or geography. The peaceful schoolmaster was still there, would always be there, but something older and more dangerous stirred beneath that gentle surface like a wolf that scents blood on the wind. The dust cloud resolved into 6 riders as they crested the hill overlooking Cedar Ridge, their horses lathered with sweat and their faces hidden beneath the brims of well-worn hats. At their head rode Silas Blackwood, a man whose reputation preceded him like the stench of death. His massive frame filled the saddle of a coal-black stallion, and twin Colt revolvers hung at his hips in tooled leather holsters that had seen more blood than most battlefields. A jagged scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, a souvenir from a knife fight in Amarillo that had left 3 men dead and Blackwood with a permanent sneer. Behind him rode his lieutenants, each man chosen for his particular brand of cruelty. Jake Morrell possessed hands quick enough to outdraw most gunfighters and a soul black enough to enjoy killing children. Bull Hendricks earned his nickname through sheer size and the pleasure he took in breaking bones with his bare hands. The others, Coyote Sam, Dutch Williams, and Knife Eye Pete, completed a collection of human predators that had terrorized 3 territories and left a trail of burned towns and unmarked graves. The gang descended into Cedar Ridge like a plague of locusts, their horses' hooves thundering against the hard-packed earth of Main Street. Shopkeepers emerged from their establishments, then quickly retreated as recognition dawned. Word of the Blackwood gang's approach had reached town 2 days prior through a wounded rider who had escaped their last rampage, but hope had persisted that they might pass through without stopping. That hope died as Silas Blackwood dismounted outside Thompson's general store and kicked open the door with his boot. Inside the store, elderly Chester Thompson stood behind his counter with trembling hands, his wife Martha cowering beside the pickle barrel. Blackwood's voice carried the rough authority of a man accustomed to absolute obedience. "This here's a nice little town you got, old man. Shame if something was to happen to it. We've come to collect taxes on behalf of the territorial government." Thompson's voice quavered as he replied that Cedar Ridge had already paid its territorial taxes through the proper channels. Blackwood's laugh echoed through the store like the sound of coffin nails being hammered. "Well now, those was the old taxes. These here are the new ones. Call it insurance against accidents. Lots of accidents seem to happen to towns that don't pay their fair share." The extortion continued for 20 minutes, with Blackwood's men systematically visiting each business establishment in town. The barber shop, the saloon, the livery stable, and the boarding house all received the same treatment. Resistance was met with casual violence. When the blacksmith protested that he had no money to spare, Dutch Williams demonstrated his disagreement by shattering the man's anvil with a sledgehammer. When the saloon keeper suggested they might find better pickings in larger towns, Knife-Eye Pete carved his initials into the bar top with a blade that moved like liquid silver. By the time the gang regrouped in front of the schoolhouse, word had spread throughout Cedar Ridge that the Blackwood gang meant to stay until their demands were met. What those demands were beyond money became clear when Silas Blackwood studied the modest building with calculating eyes. His scarred face split into a grin that revealed teeth stained brown by tobacco and neglect. "This here's perfect, boys. Every town's got children, and every parent's got a soft spot. We'll just borrow a few of these young ones as insurance while the good folks of Cedar Ridge gather up our fees. Nothing motivates cooperation like knowing your children might not come home for supper." The gang dismounted and approached the schoolhouse with the casual confidence of men who had never faced serious opposition. Their spurs rang against the wooden steps as they climbed to the front porch, and their shadows fell across the threshold like an eclipse of evil. Silas Blackwood didn't bother to knock. He simply turned the handle and stepped inside, his men flowing in behind him like water through a broken dam. Inside the schoolhouse, Ezra Whitman stood beside his desk with the afternoon's arithmetic problems still chalked on the board behind him. 23 children sat frozen at their desks, their young faces reflecting confusion and growing fear. Sarah Beth Caldwell gripped her slate so tightly her knuckles showed white, her cornflower blue eyes wide with terror that went deeper than the immediate threat. She had seen such men before, on the night her parents died. Blackwood's voice filled the room with mock politeness that somehow made his words more threatening than shouting would have been. "Well now, what have we here? A whole classroom full of little angels. And you must be the teacher. Tell me, old man, how attached are these children to going home tonight?" Ezra remained motionless beside his desk, his pale gray eyes studying each member of the gang with the same careful attention he might give to a difficult mathematical problem. When he spoke, his voice carried the gentle authority the children knew, but something else lay beneath it like ice beneath still water. "The children stay here," he said quietly. "You gentlemen should move along." Blackwood's scarred face registered momentary surprise before erupting into laughter that his men quickly echoed. "The teacher thinks he's in charge, boys. Old fool probably thinks that rusty rifle on his wall might scare us. What are you going to do, Grandpa? Bore us to death with your lessons about reading and writing?" The mockery continued as the gang spread through the classroom, their presence contaminating the peaceful space like smoke from a garbage fire. Jake Morrell knocked books from their shelves while Bull Hendricks overturned a desk just to hear it crash. Dutch Williams spat tobacco juice on the clean floor, and Coyote Sam began scratching obscenities into the wall with his knife. Through it all, Ezra Whitman remained motionless, his eyes tracking each movement with unnatural focus. But before we continue with what happened next, if you're enjoying this tale of an old teacher facing impossible odds, take a moment to hit that like button. And if you're not subscribed yet, make sure to join us for more stories of courage and justice. Comment below and let me know what country you're listening from. I love seeing how these stories travel around the world and bring us together. Now, stay with me until the end, because what's coming will surprise you in ways you never expected. The entertainment ended abruptly when Jake Morrell decided to make his point more directly. He moved toward the front row of desks where Sarah Beth sat frozen with terror, his hand reaching out to grab her arm and haul her from her seat. His fingers had barely touched the fabric of her dress when everything in the schoolhouse changed. Ezra Whitman's transformation was subtle but absolute. His shoulders, which had carried the gentle stoop of an elderly teacher, straightened into the rigid posture of a soldier at attention. The pale gray eyes that had shown kindness to children now held the cold emptiness of winter skies. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped to barely above a whisper, but every word carried through the room with crystal clarity. "Take your hand off the child," he said, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The man who had stood there moments before was gone, replaced by something infinitely more dangerous. Last chance to ride out with your lives. Jake Morrell's hand froze inches from Sarah Beth's trembling form as something in that voice triggered instincts honed by years of violence. Blackwood himself felt a chill run down his spine, though his pride prevented him from showing weakness in front of his men. Behind Ezra, the Winchester rifle mounted above the chalkboard seemed to draw the eye like a magnet, its brass receiver gleaming with the patina of long use and careful maintenance. For the first time since entering the schoolhouse, the Blackwood gang found themselves facing something they had never encountered before, a man who showed no fear in their presence. The children sensed the change as well, their terrified sobs quieting as they instinctively recognized that their gentle teacher had become something else entirely. Sarah Beth looked up at Ezra with wonder replacing fear, seeing in his weathered face the same calm certainty that had once belonged to her father when danger threatened their family. Blackwood attempted to reassert his authority through volume and profanity, but his words rang hollow in the charged atmosphere of the schoolhouse. "You threatening us, old man? You and what army going to make us leave? That pop gun on your wall probably ain't been fired in 20 years. Ezra's response came without emotion, delivered in the same tone he might use to explain a simple arithmetic problem. 47 men learned too late that underestimating me was their final mistake. You can be 48 through 54, or you can walk out that door and keep breathing. Your choice." The number 47 hung in the air like gun smoke, carrying implications that penetrated even the gang's arrogant confidence. Men who lived by violence understood the significance of such precision. A man didn't claim that many kills unless he could back up the boast, and something in Ezra Whitman's absolute stillness suggested that backing up was exactly what he intended to do. The schoolhouse door burst open with enough force to rattle the windows, and Deputy Tom Brennan stumbled inside, with his badge glinting in the afternoon light. At 24, he represented the sum total of Cedar Ridge's law enforcement, appointed more for his eagerness to serve than any particular skill with firearms. His face was flushed from running, and his hand rested uncertainly on the butt of a Colt revolver that had seen little use beyond target practice on tin cans. Tom's entrance brought the standoff to a momentary halt as all eyes turned toward the young lawman. His mouth opened to deliver what was undoubtedly meant to be an authoritative demand for order, but the words died in his throat as his gaze fell upon the tableau before him. 6 hardened outlaws faced a solitary elderly teacher across a classroom full of terrified children, and something in the quality of that teacher's stillness made Deputy Brennan's blood run cold. "Sweet Jesus," Tom whispered, his voice barely audible above the sound of his own rapid breathing. "That can't be. It just can't be." The recognition hit him like a physical blow, memories flooding back from his training days at the Ranger Academy in Austin. Every recruit had heard the stories, passed down through generations of lawmen like sacred scripture. The tale spoke of a legend who had cleaned up the most dangerous towns on the frontier, a man whose very name could make hardened criminals surrender without a fight. They called him the schoolmaster, not because he taught children, but because he educated outlaws in the permanent consequences of their choices. Tom's eyes moved from Ezra's rigid posture to the Winchester mounted above the chalkboard, and suddenly details that had seemed merely decorative took on sinister significance. The rifle's brass receiver gleamed not just with polish, but with the patina that came from constant use and meticulous care. The wooden stock, he realized with growing amazement, bore a series of small notches carved with mathematical precision. 47 marks, each one representing a life taken in service of justice. The deputy's memories crystallized around stories told in hushed voices by senior rangers who had served alongside the legend. Ezra Whitman had cleaned up Deadwood when no other lawman would take the assignment. He had brought order to Tombstone by facing down the Clanton gang in a shootout that left 5 men dead and the town permanently pacified. Silver Creek, Bitter End, Salvation, all had known peace only after the schoolmaster arrived to deliver his particular brand of education. More than his gun work, though, Ezra Whitman was remembered for his teaching. Half the current Texas Rangers had learned their craft under his instruction, trained in tactics and marksmanship by a man who understood violence as thoroughly as any scholar understood mathematics. They said he could read a man's intentions from the set of his shoulders, predict a draw from the twitch of an eye, and deliver death with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. "Boys," Deputy Tom said, his voice cracking with nervous tension, You might want to reconsider your position here. That there ain't just any schoolteacher. Silas Blackwood's scarred face twisted into a sneer of contempt as he dismissed the young deputy's warning. This old fool, he said with theatrical gestures toward Ezra. He's just a teacher, boy. Probably never fired that museum piece on his wall. You best run along and let the men handle this situation. The gang's laughter filled the schoolhouse like the sound of carrion birds, but their mirth died abruptly as Ezra Whitman moved for the first time since their confrontation began. His motion was deliberate and unhurried as he reached toward the Winchester mounted above the chalkboard. The outlaws expected to see the trembling hands of an elderly man attempting to bluff his way through a hopeless situation. Instead, they witnessed something that chilled them to the bone. Ezra's hands moved with the steady certainty of a man who had performed this same action countless times over decades of violence. There was no hesitation, no tremor, no sign that age had diminished the muscle memory carved into his very bones. When his fingers closed around the rifle's stock, the weapon seemed to come alive in his grasp, transforming from decoration into instrument of death in the space of a heartbeat. "Wait," Dutch Williams said, his voice rising with the first note of uncertainty the gang had displayed. "Whitman, that name sounds familiar. Where have I heard that name before?" Jake Morrell's face had gone pale beneath his stubble as the implications penetrated his consciousness. "You don't think," he stammered, looking between his companions with growing alarm. "The Ezra Whitman, the one they called the schoolmaster." The name hung in the air like a curse, carrying with it the weight of legend and the promise of violent retribution. Even hardened outlaws who had never set foot in Texas had heard whispers of the schoolmaster. Stories passed through the criminal underworld like warnings about plague or wildfire. Men spoke of him in the same hushed tones reserved for natural disasters and acts of divine judgment. Silas Blackwood felt his confidence wavering for the first time in years, though his pride prevented him from showing weakness before his men. "Fairy tales," he declared with forced bravado. "Old wives' tales told to scare children. The schoolmaster's been retired for 20 years, probably dead and buried." Ezra's voice cut through the gang's nervous chatter like a blade through silk, calm and precise as a mathematical equation. 23 years as a Texas Ranger," he said without emotion. "Cleaned up 5 territories. Trained half the men currently wearing badges. Killed 47 outlaws, all of them given the same choice I'm offering you." As he spoke, Ezra's transformation completed itself before their eyes. The gentle stoop disappeared entirely, revealing shoulders that remained broad and powerful despite his years. The wire-rimmed spectacles came off with one smooth motion, exposing pale gray eyes that held the cold emptiness of winter skies. When he moved, it was with the fluid grace of a predator, every motion economical and purposeful. The children sensed the change as clearly as the adults, their terrified sobs giving way to awed silence. Sarah Beth Caldwell stared up at her teacher with wonder, recognizing in him something she had only seen once before in her father during the last moments of his life. This was what a protector looked like when all pretense fell away, what justice looked like when it took human form. 47 men learned too late that underestimating me was their final mistake. Ezra continued in that same emotionless tone. "You can be 48 through 54, or you can walk out that door and keep breathing. But understand this. If you choose violence, none of you will leave this schoolhouse alive." The outlaws found themselves trapped not just by geography, but by legend itself. They had entered the schoolhouse expecting to terrorize children and an elderly teacher. Instead, they faced a man whose very name was synonymous with the violent end of criminal careers. The comfortable weight of their weapons seemed suddenly insufficient against an opponent who had survived decades of gunfights that lesser men had not. Deputy Tom Brennan pressed himself against the wall, his hand frozen on his weapon as he watched history unfold before his eyes. The stories had always seemed too fantastic to be true, tales of one man single-handedly bringing order to chaos. Now he understood that the stories, if anything, had understated the reality. The schoolmaster stood before them not as legend but as living fact, and the education was about to begin. The Winchester rifle settled into Ezra Whitman's hands like it was returning home after a long journey, the weapon's familiar weight awakening muscle memory that 20 years of peaceful retirement had never fully erased. His fingers found their natural positions along the stock and barrel, movements so automatic they seemed choreographed by decades of practice. When he worked the lever action to chamber a round, the metallic sound echoed through the schoolhouse with the finality of a judge's gavel. 23 years wearing the star, Ezra said, his voice carrying the flat certainty of a man reciting mathematical facts. Started in 1851 when Texas was still wild enough to kill a man for the shirt on his back. Ended in 1874 when civilization finally caught up to most of the frontier. In between those years, I cleaned up 5 territories that other lawmen wouldn't touch. The gang members shifted nervously as the legend took shape before their eyes, spoken in the same measured tone Ezra might use to explain long division to his students. Deadwood was first, back in '53 when it was nothing but gambling halls and murder every Saturday night. The territorial government sent 4 marshals before me. None of them lasted a week. I stayed 2 years and left behind a town where children could walk the streets after dark. As he spoke, Ezra's free hand moved with casual precision to a section of the classroom wall where a large map of Texas hung in its frame. What appeared to be a simple teaching aid swung aside on hidden hinges, revealing a recessed cabinet containing 3 more rifles and enough ammunition to supply a small army. The children gasped in wonder, while the outlaws felt their confidence drain away like water from a cracked barrel. Tombstone came next. Ezra continued without acknowledging the revealed arsenal. 1856. The Clanton gang had turned that town into their personal kingdom, taking what they wanted and killing anyone who objected. Federal marshal requested assistance after losing 3 deputies. I arrived on a Tuesday morning, and by Thursday evening, 5 members of the Clanton organization had received their final education in the consequences of lawlessness. Jake Morrell's face had gone ashen as he recognized the name from stories told in saloons and around outlaw campfires throughout the territories. Every criminal who had survived more than a few years on the frontier knew about Tombstone, knew about the shootout that had ended with bodies stacked like cordwood in front of the Silver Dollar Saloon. The man responsible for that carnage stood before them now, aged but apparently far from helpless. Silver Creek, Bitter End, and Salvation followed in the years after, Ezra said as he moved to another section of the classroom. Behind a bookshelf containing primers and arithmetic texts lay another hidden compartment, this one holding boxes of cartridges arranged with the same precision he brought to organizing lesson plans. Each town received the same treatment. Clear communication of expectations, fair warning to those engaged in criminal behavior, and permanent resolution of the problem when warnings went unheeded. Silas Blackwood's scarred face twitched with mounting anxiety as the scope of his miscalculation became clear. Stories about the schoolmaster had always seemed exaggerated, the kind of tall tales that grew with each telling around campfires and in barrooms. Standing face to face with the legend himself, Blackwood realized the stories had probably understated rather than embellished the truth. But it wasn't just the gun work that made me valuable to the territorial government, Ezra continued, moving between his students' desks with the fluid grace of a man surveying a battlefield. After Salvation, they sent me the young men who wanted to become rangers themselves. This very schoolhouse served as training ground for 2 generations of lawmen. Deputy Tom Brennan nodded in stunned recognition as pieces fell into place. Buck Morrison had been his instructor at the academy, a legendary ranger whose skill with weapons was matched only by his tactical brilliance. Wild Bill Hendricks commanded the Austin district with a reputation for fairness and uncompromising justice. Texas Tom McGraw had cleaned up the border counties single-handed, turning chaos into order through methods both direct and effective. They all learned their trade right here, Ezra said, gesturing toward the desks where his current students sat frozen in fascination. Mathematics and reading in the morning, tactical thinking and marksmanship in the afternoon. Taught them to read sign and track movement, to predict an opponent's actions from the smallest tells. Showed them how to end conflicts with minimum bloodshed while ensuring they never had to be repeated. The classroom that had seemed so ordinary to the children now revealed itself as something altogether different. What they had taken for simple decoration was actually a carefully designed training facility. The arrangement of desks provided multiple firing positions with overlapping fields of fire. Windows were positioned to eliminate blind spots while offering clear sight lines to every approach route. Even the potbelly stove was positioned to provide cover while maintaining mobility throughout the room. "This here's the most secure building in 3 counties," Ezra observed with professional satisfaction. "Designed it myself with input from military engineers who'd studied defensive positions during the war. Every angle calculated, every approach covered, every escape route anticipated and closed off. More outlaws have surrendered just from hearing they'd have to face me in this room than ever made the mistake of actually trying it." Dutch Williams attempted to maintain his bravado with words that sounded hollow even to his own ears. "That was 20 years ago, old man. You're past your prime. Probably can't even see the sights on that rifle without your spectacles." Ezra's response was to smoothly raise the Winchester to his shoulder and put 3 rounds through the center of a map tack on the far wall, the shots coming so quickly they sounded like a single extended crack of thunder. The precision was surgical, the speed inhuman, and the message unmistakable. When the gun smoke cleared, the map tack was gone, and 3 holes formed a triangle small enough to be covered by a silver dollar. The demonstration left the gang staring in horrified fascination at what they had awakened. This was not the fumbling of an elderly man trying to recapture lost youth. This was the deadly precision of a master craftsman whose skills had been honed by decades of mortal practice and maintained through 20 years of quiet discipline. The 47 notches on the rifle stock suddenly seemed less like bragging and more like bookkeeping. Coyote Sam's voice cracked as he spoke, the casual cruelty that had defined his personality evaporating in the face of imminent mortality. "Mr. Whitman, sir, we didn't know who you were. If we'd known, we never would have bothered your town." Ezra's pale gray eyes fixed on the outlaw with the intensity of a hawk studying prey, and when he spoke his voice carried no warmth whatsoever. "Ignorance of consequences doesn't excuse the choices that led to them, son. Every man in this room made decisions that brought them to this moment. The lesson ends when you decide whether to learn from those choices or die from them." The children watched in awed silence as their gentle teacher completed his transformation into something from their most thrilling nightmares and dreams combined. This was the hero from the dime novels they read in secret, the champion who appeared when evil seemed unstoppable. Sarah Beth Caldwell felt her terror transforming into fierce pride as she realized the man who read her stories and helped with her arithmetic was the same legend who had cleaned up the most dangerous places on Earth. Knife-Eye Pete made the mistake of reaching slowly toward his weapon, perhaps hoping to catch the old ranger off guard. Ezra's response was immediate and educational. The Winchester's muzzle tracked toward Pete with machine-like precision, while Ezra's voice remained conversational. "I wouldn't complete that motion if I were you. The last man who drew on me in this classroom left a stain on the floorboards that required 3 sandings to remove." The tactical situation had become clear to everyone in the room, outlaw and child alike. 6 men had entered the schoolhouse expecting to terrorize an elderly teacher and his helpless students. Instead, they found themselves trapped in a carefully designed killing ground with a legendary gunfighter whose reputation was built on 47 previous victories in similar circumstances. The schoolmaster's classroom was about to claim its next graduates, and the final examination would be graded in blood. Blackwood's voice carried a note of desperate bargaining as the reality of his situation penetrated his criminal arrogance. "Now hold on there, schoolmaster. No need for this to get unpleasant. We can work something out, maybe come to an understanding that benefits everyone involved." Ezra's response carried the finality of divine judgment delivered through human agency. "The time for understanding passed when you put your hands on my students. This is a schoolhouse, and today's lesson is about the consequences of terrorizing children. Class is now in session." The first shot erupted from Knife-Eye Pete's revolver in a desperate attempt to catch the legendary gunfighter off guard, the bullet splintering the chalkboard inches from where Ezra's head had been a heartbeat before. The schoolmaster's response was surgical in its precision and terrifying in its speed. The Winchester barked once, and Pete's gun hand exploded in a spray of blood and bone fragments as the .4440 round shattered every finger and sent his weapon spinning across the classroom floor. Pete's scream of agony was cut short by a second shot that punched through his chest with the finality of a period ending a sentence. The outlaw crumpled beside the overturned desk he had kicked earlier, his knife-scarred face frozen in an expression of shocked disbelief. The 47 notches on the Winchester's stock had just become 48. "Children, down behind your desks," Ezra commanded in the same tone he might use to announce recess, his voice cutting through the gunsmoke and chaos with absolute authority. "Sarah Beth, take the little ones to the corner where we keep the primer books. Stay low and keep quiet." The remaining 5 gang members scattered through the classroom like startled birds, their earlier confidence shattered along with their companions' bones. They had expected to face a helpless old man, not a tactical genius who had spent decades perfecting the art of close-quarters combat in exactly this environment. Every move they made played directly into strategies Ezra had refined through years of training the best rangers in Texas. Bull Hendricks attempted to use his massive size to advantage by overturning the teacher's desk and using it as a barrier while he returned fire. His first shot went wide as Ezra seemed to vanish into the maze of student desks like smoke dissolving into air. The schoolmaster's movement through the familiar terrain was poetry written in violence, each step calculated to maintain multiple firing angles while denying his opponents clean shots. The Winchester spoke again from an unexpected direction as Ezra materialized behind the bookshelf that concealed one of his ammunition caches. Bull's improvised fortification provided no protection against an attack from his flank, and the heavy rifle bullet punched through both the desk and the outlaw's torso with devastating effect. The giant toppled forward across the splintered wood, his blood mixing with spilled ink from broken bottles. Dutch Williams and Coyote Sam attempted a coordinated assault from opposite sides of the classroom, hoping to catch the legendary gunfighter in a crossfire that would overwhelm even his legendary skills. They had forgotten that this schoolhouse had been designed by a man who understood military tactics better than most generals. Ezra had anticipated this exact maneuver years ago, positioning mirrors among his teaching materials to eliminate blind spots and provide early warning of flanking movements. The reflection of Sam's advance allowed Ezra to track his position while maintaining focus on Dutch's more obvious approach. When both outlaws committed to their attack, they discovered that their target had again disappeared, leaving them firing at shadows while death approached from an angle they had never considered. The Winchester's lever action worked with mechanical precision as Ezra sent 2 rounds toward Dutch Williams, the first shattering the man's gun arm, and the second ending his participation in earthly affairs permanently. Coyote Sam found himself alone and exposed in the center of the classroom, his weapon trained on empty air while the schoolmaster's rifle covered him from a position of absolute tactical superiority. The outlaw's hands began to shake as the reality of his situation penetrated his consciousness. He was facing a man who had survived dozens of similar encounters, who had trained half the Rangers in Texas, who moved through gunfights like other men move through Sunday church services. "Please," Sam stammered, his weapon wavering as his nerve failed him completely. "I got a family back in Missouri. Little children who ain't never done nothing wrong. I was just trying to make enough money to get them through the winter." Ezra's response came without emotion, delivered in the same tone he might use to explain why arithmetic problems required correct answers. "Every choice has consequences, son. You chose to ride with men who terrorize children. You chose to enter my classroom with violent intent. Those choices led you here, and here is where they end." The Winchester fired once more, and Coyote Sam joined his companions in whatever judgment awaited men who preyed upon innocence. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of brass cartridges hitting the wooden floor as Ezra reloaded his weapon with movements too practiced to require conscious thought. Jake Morrell had pressed himself against the far wall near the window that faced west toward the Badlands, his revolver forgotten in his hand as he watched death work its way systematically through his companions. The man he had attempted to grab was Sarah Beth Caldwell, the 80-year-old girl who now watched from the corner with eyes that held no fear, only awe at seeing her gentle teacher transform into an instrument of perfect justice. "You made a child cry," Ezra observed as he approached Morrell's position with the patience of a man who had all the time in the world. "That was your mistake. Children should feel safe in a schoolhouse, protected and valued and free from the kind of fear you brought into their world." Morrell's attempt to surrender came too late, and rang hollow with insincerity. His hand was already moving toward his weapon when Ezra's shot took him center mass, the impact slamming him against the window frame he would never escape through. The glass behind him spiderwebbed with cracks that caught the afternoon light like a broken kaleidoscope. Only Silas Blackwood remained now, the gang leader who had built his reputation on terrorizing peaceful communities and murdering those too weak to resist. He had taken shelter behind the potbelly stove, using the iron bulk as protection while he tried to process the systematic destruction of his organization. 6 men had entered this schoolhouse as predators, and 5 of them had been educated in the permanent consequences of their life choices. The silence stretched between the 2 survivors of the gunfight, broken only by the sound of children breathing and the distant noise of townsfolk gathering outside. Deputy Tom Brennan remained pressed against the wall where he had taken cover when the shooting started, his own weapon drawn but forgotten as he watched history unfold before his eyes. This was how legends were born, in moments when ordinary men revealed themselves to be anything but ordinary. "Come out, Blackwood," Ezra called in conversational tones as he moved to position himself with clear sight lines around the stove. "This can end with your surrender, or it can end with your death. The choice is yours, but it ends either way." Blackwood's scarred face appeared around the edge of the iron stove, his twin revolvers gleaming in hands that had killed dozens of innocent people across 3 territories. His voice carried the desperate fury of a man who had finally encountered something he could not intimidate or corrupt or destroy through casual violence. "You think you're better than me, old man, but we're the same. We're both killers. We've both spilled blood and left widows and orphans in our wake. The only difference is you had a badge to make it legal." Ezra's response carried the weight of 23 years spent walking the line between civilization and chaos, between justice and vengeance, between protecting the innocent and becoming the very evil he fought against. "The difference is that I chose to stop. I hung up my guns and tried to build something good in this world. You chose to keep taking from it until someone stopped you permanently." The final exchange of gunfire lasted perhaps 3 seconds, but seemed to unfold with the slow inevitability of sunrise. Blackwood emerged from his cover with both weapons blazing, his shots wild with desperation and rage. Ezra stood his ground in the center of the classroom, the Winchester rising to his shoulder with mechanical precision. The legendary gunfighter's single shot took the gang leader in the chest with the authority of final judgment, ending a criminal career that had spread misery across half the frontier. Silas Blackwood toppled backward against the potbelly stove, his twin revolvers clattering to the floor as his hands lost their grip on earthly concerns. His scarred face held an expression of surprise, as if he had never truly believed that men like Ezra Whitman existed outside of stories told to frighten children into good behavior. The Winchester's 47 notches had become 54, and the Blackwood gang was now nothing more than a cautionary tale for future generations of outlaws. The schoolmaster's classroom had delivered its lesson with the thoroughness that had made Ezra Whitman a legend throughout the territories. In the aftermath of violence, Ezra moved among his students with the same gentle care he had always shown, checking each child for injury and offering comfort to those traumatized by witnessing necessary but terrible justice. His pale gray eyes had already begun to lose their winter coldness, warmth returning as the gentle teacher reclaimed dominance over the legendary gunfighter who had emerged to protect his charges. "The lesson is finished," he announced quietly, setting the Winchester back in its brackets above the chalkboard where it belonged. "School is dismissed for today." The gun smoke hung in the afternoon air like morning fog, drifting slowly through the schoolhouse windows as Ezra Whitman moved among his students with the same gentle attention he had always shown them. His weathered hands, which moments before had dealt death with surgical precision, now checked each child for injuries with the tenderness of a grandfather caring for beloved grandchildren. The transformation back to the peaceful teacher was as complete as his earlier metamorphosis into the legendary gunfighter had been. 23 young faces looked up at him with expressions that ranged from awe to confusion to something approaching worship. They had witnessed their mild-mannered instructor become something from their most thrilling dreams, a hero who had appeared when evil seemed overwhelming and delivered justice with the finality of mathematical proof. The gentle man who helped them with arithmetic and reading had revealed himself as the legendary schoolmaster, protector of the innocent and educator of those who chose violence over law. Sarah Beth Caldwell approached him with the fearless curiosity of childhood, her cornflower blue eyes bright with questions that her 80-year-old vocabulary could not adequately express. The blood on the classroom floor and the bodies of dead outlaws seemed to concern her far less than the welfare of the man who had saved them all. Her small hand reached out to touch his arm with the instinctive need for reassurance that children possess. "Mr. Whitman," she asked in a voice barely above a whisper, "will you still teach us tomorrow? I need to learn my multiplication tables for the test next week." The question struck Ezra with unexpected force, carrying implications that penetrated deeper than outlaw bullets ever could. This child, who had already lost her parents to violence, was asking whether the return of his deadly past would steal away the peaceful present they had built together. Her innocent trust demanded an answer that went beyond simple reassurance to touch the very core of who he had chosen to become. "Always, little one," he replied, kneeling to her level so their eyes met directly. "Nothing that happened here today changes that. You'll learn your multiplication tables, and Marcus will finish his geography project, and we'll read another chapter from that story about the brave princess. School continues tomorrow, just as it always has." As he spoke, Ezra's gaze moved to the Winchester rifle resting in its brackets above the chalkboard, 7 fresh notches carved into its stock joining the 47 that had marked his previous career. The weapon that had served as classroom decoration for 20 years had reclaimed its original purpose with deadly efficiency, but he felt no satisfaction in its return to violence. Each notch represented a failure of civilization, a moment when words and law had proven insufficient and death had become the only teacher that evil would heed. The schoolhouse door opened to admit the townspeople of Cedar Ridge, their faces reflecting a mixture of gratitude, amazement, and something approaching religious reverence. They had entrusted their children to a gentle elderly teacher and discovered that their faith had been protected by one of the greatest legends in frontier history. The peaceful community that had grown around the schoolhouse now understood that their safety had always rested in the hands of a man whose reputation was written in the blood of those who preyed upon innocence. Deputy Tom Brennan stepped carefully among the bodies of the Blackwood gang, his young face pale with the realization of what he had witnessed. The stories told at the Ranger Academy had always seemed like exaggerations, tales grown larger with each telling around campfires and in saloons. Standing in the aftermath of the schoolmaster's return to action, Tom understood that the legends had understated rather than embellished the truth. "I'll need to send word to Austin," Tom said, his voice carrying the careful respect of a student addressing a revered teacher. "Captain Morrison will want a full report on what happened here. The territorial government's been hunting the Blackwood gang for 2 years without success." Ezra nodded his acknowledgement while his hands continued their gentle inventory of his students, checking for cuts from flying glass and bruises from taking shelter behind their desks. "Tell Buck that his old instructor sends his regards," he said quietly, "and remind him that some lessons need to be taught only once if they're delivered with sufficient clarity." The cleanup that followed carried an air of solemn ceremony as the townspeople worked to remove all traces of violence from the sacred space where their children learned and grew. The blood was scrubbed from the floorboards with the thoroughness of atonement, broken glass was swept away and replaced, and overturned furniture was restored to its proper positions. When the work was finished, the schoolhouse looked exactly as it had that morning, save for the 7 fresh notches on the rifle above the chalkboard. That evening, as Cedar Ridge settled into the peace that came from knowing the Blackwood gang would never terrorize another community, Ezra sat alone in his classroom, grading arithmetic papers by lamplight. The familiar routine provided comfort after a day that had forced him to confront the violent past he had tried to leave behind. Each correct answer represented hope for the future, proof that education and civilization could triumph over chaos and cruelty given sufficient time and patience. 1 week later, the first new students arrived from neighboring communities, their parents having heard stories of the teacher who had single-handedly destroyed the most feared gang in 3 territories. These families sought not just education for their children, but the protection that came from proximity to a living legend. The one-room schoolhouse that had served 23 students now accommodated nearly 40, with children walking miles each day for the privilege of learning from the schoolmaster himself. The curriculum expanded to accommodate the increased enrollment and the heightened expectations of parents who understood their children's unique opportunity. Mathematics and reading remained central, but Ezra began incorporating lessons in history that drew from his personal experience, geography that included practical knowledge of frontier survival, and ethical discussions that explored the difference between justice and vengeance. His students learned not just facts and figures, but wisdom earned through decades of walking the line between civilization and chaos. 3 months after the confrontation with the Blackwood Gang, young men began arriving from across Texas seeking training that no formal academy could provide. They came with letters of introduction from rangers and marshals who had learned their trade in this very classroom, requesting that their protégés receive instruction from the master himself. These aspiring lawmen ranged in age from 18 to 30, all drawn by stories of the legendary gunfighter who had transformed education into preparation for the sacred duty of protecting innocence. The afternoons belonged to these older students, who learned tactics and marksmanship in sessions that pushed the boundaries of their courage and skill. Ezra taught them to read sign and predict behavior, to end conflicts with minimum bloodshed while ensuring they never needed to be repeated. The hidden arsenal behind maps and bookcases served its original purpose once again, though the weapons were now used for instruction rather than immediate survival. Word of the schoolmaster's return to active training spread through law enforcement circles like wildfire, bringing requests for consultation on difficult cases and invitations to assist with operations that required his particular expertise. Ezra declined most such requests, preferring to focus on teaching the next generation rather than personally confronting every outbreak of lawlessness. His greatest contribution would be the men he trained, rangers and marshals who carried his lessons into territories he would never visit. The dual nature of the schoolhouse became its defining characteristic as months turned to years. Children learned their letters and numbers in the morning, while future lawmen studied the science of justice in the afternoon. The gentle teacher who read stories about brave princesses coexisted peacefully with the legendary gunfighter who had killed 54 men in service of civilization. Both roles demanded absolute dedication, and Ezra found that each strengthened the other in ways he had never anticipated. Sarah Beth Caldwell grew into a remarkable young woman under Ezra's tutelage, her quick mind and natural courage marking her as destined for greatness in whatever field she chose to pursue. She learned mathematics and literature alongside the sons and daughters of farmers and merchants, but she also absorbed lessons about courage and justice that would shape her character for life. The child who had witnessed the destruction of the Blackwood Gang carried within her an unshakable faith in the power of good to triumph over evil when backed by sufficient determination. 5 years after that violent afternoon in the schoolhouse, Cedar Ridge had become known throughout Texas as a center of learning and law enforcement training. The community that had grown around Ezra's teaching attracted families seeking the best education for their children and young men pursuing careers in frontier justice. The modest town evolved into something approaching a small city, its growth fueled by the reputation of the man who taught multiplication tables in the morning and tactical thinking in the afternoon. On quiet evenings when his students had departed and the classroom stood empty save for memories, Ezra would sometimes study the Winchester rifle mounted above his chalkboard. 54 notches marked its stock now, each one representing a life taken in defense of innocence and civilization. The weapon served as both decoration and reminder, a symbol of the price that must sometimes be paid to maintain the peace necessary for children to learn and grow. The letters that arrived weekly from former students provided evidence of his lasting influence on the world beyond Cedar Ridge. Rangers trained in his classroom brought order to lawless territories throughout the West. Teachers who had learned their craft by observing his methods established schools that prioritized both academic excellence and moral development. Children who had sat in those wooden desks grew into adults who understood that education and justice were not separate pursuits, but complementary aspects of building a civilization worthy of preservation. Deputies who had witnessed his confrontation with the Blackwood Gang carried stories of that afternoon to every corner of the frontier, tales that grew in the telling but never exceeded the remarkable truth. The schoolmaster had returned to action when innocent children faced mortal danger, delivered justice with surgical precision, then resumed his peaceful calling without missing a single day of instruction. The legend became larger than the man, but the man remained focused on the daily work of shaping young minds and preparing future guardians of the law. As the sun set on another day of teaching and learning, Ezra Whitman stood before his empty classroom and reflected on the strange path that had led him from legendary gunfighter to peaceful educator and back to something that encompassed both roles. The children who would fill those desks tomorrow deserved a world where justice prevailed over cruelty, where education conquered ignorance, and where courage stood ready to defend the innocent when all other protections failed. The Winchester rifle rested in its brackets above the chalkboard, its 54 notches catching the lamplight like small stars in a dark sky. Some lessons, Ezra had learned, could only be taught through actions rather than words, demonstrations rather than explanations. The Blackwood gang had received their final education in the consequences of terrorizing children, and their permanent graduation had ensured that other families would never suffer as Sarah Beth Caldwell's had suffered. If you've stayed with me through this tale of justice delivered in a schoolhouse, I want to thank you for joining me on this journey. If this story of an old teacher who refused to let evil triumph moved you, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories of courage triumphing over cruelty. We bring you tales of justice and heroism every week, reminding us all that good people standing together can overcome any darkness. Until next time, may you find the courage to protect what matters most when the moment calls for action.